Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question. And that's going to be, okay, when you look at this, it's an apple, yeah? Generally, we know apple is good in what? Vitamins, and kind of get a sense of nutritionally rich and this and that, an apple a day and all that good stuff, right? Okay. How did we arrive at this apple? What's going on in the leaves above us? Photosynthesis, right? Okay. Photosynthesis needs carbon dioxide, water. I'm giving it away because I have 7 minutes. Okay. All right. What else? What's sunlight and something else, and from the soil, nutrients. Right. All right. So this thing and the other things. Okay, I picked up some from the garden and other places. Right. So how many of us know what is the current CO2 ppm? Right, like 450. 450.
Is it 450 or 400?
Yeah, we are at 450 and we are gaining. Okay. Sorry if I'm excited about this, but that's me. I'm an agriculturist. I work with farmers. I work with food systems. And I want to ask you one more question before we get into CO2. What system of the economic systems you think contributes the largest footprint to climate change? Anybody?
Human beings.
Yes. So all of you are my friends. Everybody knows. All right. So yes, agriculture is the largest contributor. And if I tell you that the nutrient value of this apple is going to change in a few years down the lane, how many of you are going to be surprised or not? No?
Are you surprised?
Yeah. So, yeah. And I was surprised, and I lost a lot of sleep reading those papers. And I'm a physiologist, so I studied plant physiology, and it makes absolutely straight sense to me that with increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, the plants have started behaving differently. What they are able to get into their system to manufacture what has to come into this. And this is just one example. If I'm talking about across the scale, everything is changing in plants. And just for a moment, think about it. The flowers, the pollen, and upstream, downstream of it, all organisms that are dependent on food system, the function of a plant to do its basic function, everything has a ripple effect both ways. So the bees that are picking the pollen are not actually getting the nutrient quality of the pollen is changing. So you can think about the ecosystem effects. Okay? And of course, we have to think about us, yeah? When we all the time are just looking at bottles, and I picked this up because I was curious what is maple butter. I've never used it, so I wanted to. And then I said, okay, we always look at the nutrition, whatever, and say, okay, this has this much, and my body is getting this much of nutrient by this much of whatever I'm eating. Now that is going to change, and it is already changing. So we already have enough paper publications and stories coming out, and it hasn't gained the momentum that it has to, and I'm really surprised about that. But that's something that people have started, like United Nations FAO has started noticing, and CGIAR and other international agencies are taking note of. But really, what do? The CO2 is changing, the temperatures are changing, the crops are shifting. So many of our crops, which like we can tie it up to migration of people, we can tie it up to migration of crops upstream. Now we have more viticulture practices gaining rapidly in Oregon compared to, people are shifting from California. We're going north. And so what I'm drawing at is agriculture can be a tool for both mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation, when we talk about mitigation or adaptation, basically we are at the back front, we are saying, okay, agriculture is the largest emitter. And why is agriculture the largest emitter? Anybody? Fossil fuels, that's the fundamental thing. We put fossil fuels as nutrients to grow our food, and then we manufacture it Then we package, the packet has fossil fuels, and then we are, thank you, and then we basically have this whole footprint across the food chain, and it's not just the food chain. When we think about food systems, think about this, the stuff we wear, the leather or whatever, everything is part of that agricultural system. So if we want anything to change, the fundamental thing is the story of our times is here. What are the things we can do to elicit change through our behavior, through our social networks, through things that Patrick mentioned, global collaboration, social change, and science, to use science and urban planning and nutrition RX. So we have solutions, and the thing is, how do different agencies harness this different knowledge? And one last thing, when we are talking about systematic change, there is one thing I feel we most often forget, and it's not the CO2 emissions, but the one thing is true cost accounting. Can we account for the things that we don't experience or we don't see going into our system? And that's where we are heading. Circular economies, regenerative economies, and we can talk more about it, and my time is up. All right? Thank you all for listening.
Wow, that was great. All of you. Thank you all. Well, my name's Maxine Fookson, and I just want to thank you all for having me here. And I'm on the board of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, so representing that organization. And PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, of course, we're the local chapter of a national group that consists of healthcare workers and non-healthcare workers. You don't have to be a physician, I'm not, to be a member of it. But the focus of the group for many, many years has been on preventing that which we can't cure. And so PSR started very, very actively as an anti-nuclear, anti-military organization, and has realized over the years, and for many years, recognized the connection between militarization and climate change, and so has focused our work in both of those areas, anti-military and addressing climate issues. So I want to talk, my little few minutes is a little bit separate about this because it's a little bit of a Debbie Downer, I guess, because I'm going to talk about militarism. And I think we're going to come back, I hope, to talk more about solutions because I might run out of time. But so I'll just tell you my story a bit. In 1976, I was just newly a year or so out of nursing school, and I went to work in Salinas, California. I was at that time a nurse. I'm now a nurse practitioner. I went to work in Salinas in a United Farm Workers Health Clinic that served farm workers working in California's Central Valley, that vast area of really corporate agriculture. And I have a memory that happened many times that I'll just never forget, which is in the clinic, in the bustling waiting room full of families, moms, infants, pregnant women, working men, busy waiting room. Somehow a call would go out that I never really understood where it came from, that La Migra, or what we now know as Border Patrol or ICE, The van was near the clinic. And all of a sudden, this bustling waiting room would empty out. I have no idea. People left through windows, through back doors. It was completely quiet. And it happened many times. And it left me realizing, what is it like to be here in a place and have to be in hiding or afraid for what would happen? And that was years ago, and it's certainly much worse now. And what is the impact of that on one's life in terms of health and mental health? And I think we know now the chronic stress and trauma. And I've seen this a lot in my work at Multnomah County Health Department as a nurse practitioner, what people have to sacrifice because of their immigration status. So I'm talking now about immigration, and I'm going to connect that with what is happening in immigration in terms of the militarization and why do people migrate? This whole issue of climate change and forced migration. We used to listen to a song in our family with our son, who was then young, by the folk singer John McCutcheon. No matter how you came to be, no matter the skin, we are all of us kin. We are all of us one family. And I think that now that is ever more true as we think about the fact that in this global climate emergency that we're in, we are one family. None of us spared. And we recognize that as in any family, there are some of us who are more vulnerable to what happens than there are others. And it's our responsibility to be there for our vulnerable family members. Think about the Bahamas. So I want to talk a little bit about the military's impact on climate generally, and then I'll talk about the US border. The US, as I think probably many people know, spends more money on the military than any other nation in the world, with an annual military budget of over $700 billion. Energy is the lifeblood of our war-fighting capabilities, said General David Petraeus. And that energy is, of course, in the form of fossil fuel use. We used to ask, what is the cost of having a military of this might? What is the cost to people, to communities, to health, education, social service programs? How does this affect the most impacted frontlines communities in our nation? And now we also have to ask, at what cost to the environment to have a military of this might? So let's just focus on the environment for this discussion. This past June, Brown University's Watson School of International Studies issued a really important report. You can just Google it. But it talks about the military as the largest institutional user of petroleum products in the world and the largest CO2 emitter. It's really significant. So our war and preparation for some sort of future conflicts, in doing so, we consume huge amounts of fossil fuel and give off equally huge amounts of emissions. And what are the threats that the military is concerned about? Certainly human adversaries, though we may not agree on who they are, Iran, North Korea, whoever, Venezuela, whatever. Another threat, guarding against those impacted by climate change. That is already in the sights of the military. So these border constructions that we see at our southern border are truly in the eyes of the military, and that's what this is all about. So while some in our government is denying climate change, the military is preparing for it. So I want to just go with my last few seconds really to talk about the militarization at the southern border, which I've visited twice now and was absolutely shocked and horrified. No longer are borders lines on a map. They are heavily militarized zones that consist of armed troops in riot gear, that consists of massive corporately funded surveillance companies, and the US military. And I brought a poster. We were down, thank you. I guess it's upside down. I just wanted to show you, this was a border action that happened last December through American Friends Service Committee. We were down, this is the San Diego-Tijuana border. And we were met by Army and US Border Patrol troops in full Army and full riot gear. And this is what the border looks like. It's not just the fence of barbed wire and cement and iron posts that we're hearing about. It is a massive surveillance. The ACLU calls the border zone a constitution-free zone because constitutional rights aren't applied in this region. And this is what's happening in our border. And I think we have to be aware of, as migration happens at greater numbers because of displacement, and I'm talking about forced migration, not necessarily at all people making the choice to move, but people who are forced by drought and flood and war and poverty, they're approaching this at our border. And I guess I question, how do we want this to be? Is this what we want our nation to be? And I'll just end with a quote. I had a billion other quotes and other things, but I'll end with a quote from Pope Francis. And he says, "The grave danger is to disown our neighbors. When we do so, we deny their humanity and our own humanity without ever realizing it." And I think that's the situation we're in. But there are some hopeful things, so I hope we get to those.
Well, thank you to our amazing panelists. Maxine, you warned us that you might be a Debbie Downer, but I personally was very inspired by what you and the rest of you had to say. So we have about 10 minutes for the panel left, and I wanted to open it all to you. What questions? Any questions? Just raise your hand and just let me know. Yes, sir. Aaron in the front.
Two questions. One of them has to do with the ability of our government to wage war, and the other is something that came up with food production. With our government's ability to wage war, basically the president has been doing whatever the president wants. Since the abolishment of the draft, we, the public, rarely feel the impact of war. Our taxes don't change, our families aren't drafted. Is there a way that we can drive a war tax or some other mechanism that makes it more painful for our government to institute or wage war? And something that would be mandatory, not something that could be just washed over. So that's the first question. The second question on food production is, as climate changes, and we talk about migration, but we also have a situation even here in Portland where apartments going up and just across the street have no room for gardens. So is there a way to develop partnerships where homeowners can partner with either apartments or with migrants to utilize the transformation of decorative gardening into food production to limit the packaging, to limit the fossil fuels for transportation? And what type of educational opportunities are there for being able to actually increase local food production on a small space?
Well, I'll just say one thing about the ability to wage war, which is, and I don't remember the amendments, but there are several in going through the Congress now that I would say look up that would limit at least presidential authority to wage war, and I think that's super important, that there's some more checks and balances. And then, that's all I'll say about that. But then the other thing I wanted to say about food production that probably others could talk about is, one of the things I'm really proud of from PSR that we were involved in was the Portland Clean Energy Fund. Are you all familiar with that? And maybe some will talk about that. So the exciting thing is, if you recall, it passed, that Portland Clean Energy Fund was a ballot measure that passed in the last election, a super important local initiative to try to bring some equity around climate justice to low income members of our community, particularly communities of color. So it's 1% surtax on big businesses, over businesses, I think it's $1 billion a year that they earn. and it will generate millions of dollars that will help with things like weatherization of homes for low-income folks, creating green spaces in neighborhoods where communities of color live, most predominantly encouraging community gardens and sustainable agriculture on a small scale. So it's a really important and exciting initiative. And the first board members for the Clean Energy Fund are going to be announced this coming Wednesday at City Council.
So your question on food security for people of color and economically challenged folks and generally urban spaces. That's what I understood. Okay, one of the things we already have is, of course, a very good community garden system, which I think is pretty well used, because I did a research on biodiversity in community gardens to understand what kind of biodiversity is here and in Seattle. So it will not answer the what can I say? Community garden is not going to answer all the food security challenges. It is just one tool. But there are other cities across U.S., for example, in Washington, in East Coast, there is a lot of momentum in how neighbors are connecting their yards to share space and opening the yard to any random person who does not have access to green space. So there are apps for that. There are, I'm happy to share those resources because that was part of my research. So there is yard sharing app, for example, where people can, grow food. And the more we think and understand about food systems, it is, what can I say, it is so disconnected from urban planning that when I go to an urban planner or any city person and say, okay, we have gardens, but can we have more gardens, and can there be an open invitation to grow food in your front yard? For example, there are places where you cannot grow food in the front yard, and I have lived in such places. But I have also worked in Oakland in California, where you can grow pretty much anything and everything in your front yard. No, there is the city supporting that. The other thing I also want to talk about food security is, right, yes, we grow our tomatoes in our garden, but where is the water coming from for this? So it has a water footprint. That is an energy footprint. So we, in Oakland and other places, and in Eugene now, we have gray water systems that are safe to bring your laundry water into your yard to grow your food. And it is safe. And that's the other research I have done with Oakland folks. So these are a couple of things. But I want to leave with this thought that it is so non-linear, the system of trying to fix food security issues. We have to think about the subsidies. We have to think about the major players who are bought into the system, including us as consumers. And as people who have the power to vote and understand what it means to be voting for certain policies, I think a lot of it rests on us in trying to understand what the city is making decisions in, especially with planning new communities. When new apartment complexes are coming up and you get a neighborhood notice that we are going to build this, do we have the right to ask for green spaces for those places? Can we have rooftop gardens, for example? So those are the things that it comes back to us as citizens, and it comes to us as consumers to be aware of what subsidies are going where and what kind of farming I should support, being a person in Portland. So yeah, that's it.
So along the food systems question, I can see a lot of potential now. I haven't talked with a lot of city planners yet, but that's on my list. A lot could be done vertically. We could look at France for that. France currently has a policy initiative that people apply for permits to plant in public places, anywhere and everywhere, as long as they get a permit for it. You could do it the more disruptive way in guerrilla garden, but long term that may or may not work. You can look at Germany for green roofs. Outgrowing Hunger is a local nonprofit who works with immigrants and refugees in community gardens. They're looking for space as we speak. They're growing quickly and they're very successful. And that the executive director, Adam Cole, is looking for spaces, perhaps yards, maybe church yards, to expand his efforts, maybe purchase some land. So reach out to him if you're interested in that. There's a community carbon initiative. It has been started by a community group. It's mostly centered around Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, and they're looking to encourage people who do have yard space to use it for carbon drawdown specifically, and a lot of people are using it for food when they do that. And there are some scientists involved in that project, and that's here locally. The other idea I had was out of the UK. Pam Warhurst, there's a TED Talk I encourage people to look at. She's inspiring. She and her team have transformed their town into a completely different economy based on vegetable tourism, and they have replaced all sorts of prickly plants with food, and they don't control who consumes it. They just invite people to come, stay, eat with them, and it's inclusive. So there are models out there, and Pam Warhurst has been featured through the UN. Those are a few ideas. I have lots of ideas in last week's.
I'm going to make this really brief because I'm going to leave these answers to the experts, but I'm just going to remind folks about the intersection of climate change policy and governance. 2014, the midterm election. What percentage of Americans voted in the midterm election in 2014? 40%. The average is 40%. In our presidential election in 2016, 61% of eligible voters voted. And in 2018, the average jumped from 40% to 53% in 2018. So thinking about the fact that 53% of the people voted, but 47% didn't vote, right? And that's an important part of realizing, and then also locally, many mayoral elections, because the climate change policy, obviously thinking about the local impact, many mayoral elections in our largest cities in the United States are not held like Portland's in a presidential year. And one of the lowest that we've looked at in our research is actually Dallas. Roughly 7% of people in the city of Dallas voted for their mayoral election. And so when we start to think about governance and climate change policy, we really got to think about the voting piece.
Add about our partner, Gibson's partner, Eco School Network. You may want to check them out. They do like pretty good work with school gardens, and I believe as a parent who has seen various elementary school to high school that it's fundamental. The school gardens teach you everything. It teaches you social justice, food justice. It teaches you biodiversity, it teaches everything. And of course, if you can bring your grey water from your hand wash, then it teaches you drought relief. So please check Eco School Network, and they are the group I am aware of locally which work with school gardens. And if you're a parent or a grandparent, they encourage you to volunteer and share your knowledge.
So can I just take us back for a few seconds from grey water and community gardens, which are fantastic, to the war question, which is kind of my area I'm working on. I think if we look at our policymakers in DC, there is what is called a Washington consensus. So it's really hard to break through there and think. Of course, we need to tweak several of the policies, I agree, and there are bills that we can support or can oppose, but we have to just break through the mythology of war. Wars are based on those myths that they're beneficial, that they're fought for freedom, and they're good for the economy. Well, they're not. They're good for a few people in the economy, but there's so much information and data now that we can inform and educate about that they're actually really bad for our economy. And you don't even have to go into the whole case about how immoral wars are.